Welcome to this webinar on FAIR data principles. My name is Carla Boersma and I'm a Communications Officer for Resilience. What are FAIR data principles? How can you work with them and what opportunities do they open up to researchers? These questions will be discussed during this one-hour webinar, which you can consider as an introduction to the world of FAIR data. Here are the three presenters. First, Roxanne Wins. Roxanne is Innovation Manager at Libis KU Leuven, and she will clarify open science as well as the topic of FAIR principles. Then Lineke Timbers. Lineke is also from KU Leuven, and she will elaborate on the conceptual side and tell us more what is behind the digital turn in religious studies. And then we will listen to Federico Alpi. Federico is affiliated researcher at the Foundation for Religious Studies in Bologna, and he will present to us what this all means to a researcher. We will now start with the presentation given by Roxanne Wins. Roxanne, please.
Thank you, Carla. So before I dive into the topic of open science, I will very shortly give an introduction to resilience as a research infrastructure. Resilience stands for Religious Studies Infrastructure, Tools, Innovation, Experts, Connections, and Centers. So with resilience, we want to have researchers get access to tools for working with their data and collections, but also introduce new innovations that are impacting religious studies researchers. And we also want to bring experts together so that they can create new connections through research by linking their research, but also their data sets, the people and projects they're working on. And together with the consortium, we're building centers of expertise through Europe. We are currently in the preparatory phase, meaning that we're still working mainly on the organizational setup of the ERIC, the European Research Infrastructure Consortium. And we're mainly working on procedures, standards, policies, and so on. So not really building the infrastructure yet. But of course, in this phase that we're preparing for the research infrastructure, we already want to start providing research services to researchers. And for that, we already have a few active services online. The most visible and successful one until now is the Transnational Access Program, which facilitates direct, fast, and effective access for scholars to objects of their research. So they can visit really the research locations, the libraries and archives of the partners involved in the TNA program. They are called the TNA hosts, and they give access to their collections of manuscripts, rare books, documents, and material. But of course, Resilience wants to add an additional layer on top of that. We want to create a kind of a unique matchmaking service, matching TNA scholars with relevant experts on the TNA host locations so they can get tailored expertise for their research projects. The TNA call of 2020 for 2023-2024 was just closed, but if you want to follow up on this, we will launch more TNA calls, so keep following our website and social channels. So another part of the active services is that there's a possibility to become a transnational access host in which you can invite scholars from Resilience to visit your collections and your labs and centers of expertise. And more information can also be found on the website on this. And then we also want to start building our community and informing them on really important topics that are taking place in the context of research in Europe. And for this, we're introducing online workshop series, and we're starting off with an online workshop on the FAIR principles and religious studies, which takes place in September on the 29th. More information can be found in the link below. And this session, this webinar, is really as a kind of first introduction, just exploring the basics, and we will dive more in depth during the workshops taking place in September. And then later in the year, in December, we will explore Ray Research, which is a unified discovery access platform, giving access to resources relevant for religious studies. And then in March, we will explore the TNA, the Transnational Access Program, in more depth. If you want to know more, follow our newsletter or follow us on social media. So into the topic of open science and research data management. Open science is a very broad theme, and it covers multiple topics. Some of them are listed here. I've taken out the 5 most important or most relevant open science topics, but there is more attached to that, and also some of the topics go broader than just open science. It's not only related to that. We're going to very shortly explore today research data management, open educational resources, citizen science, responsible research and innovation, scholarly publishing, and open access. So what is open access? Well, open access is publishing your research publications in an open way that is immediately available for the readers, for the researchers. So this means that the publication is not behind a paywall. You don't have to subscribe to a publisher platform to be able to read the publication, to read the article or the book. It's really something that has been going on for many, many years, open access, but it's growing still in importance because, of course, we all know that the rates for getting access to publications are going up all the time, with publishers requiring more money, both from the libraries who have to purchase the subscriptions with those portals, as well as for the researchers who want to access that. And we also know that in the entire world is not as doesn't have the same opportunities for paying those subscriptions. So open access is really a way that we can grant the wider public access to research findings, but also make sure that other researchers that do not have the same level of access to subscription databases and publication portals from publishers as you might have access to research publications. So open access is also a way to give more exposure to your work because it becomes immediately available worldwide. Everyone can read it and everyone can reference to it. So it leads to more practitioners that can apply your findings, and also it can influence policy, bring higher citation rates, and so on. Also, open access is becoming more and more a requirement from funders, saying that you have to publish your research results in open access, because in this way taxpayers' money is put to the use of the public who can immediately access it. And researchers from developing countries can also see your work. Open educational resources. This might be very new for people. It's been in existence for quite some years as well, but it's really with the enlargement and the more interest in open science growing in importance. And it's about sharing educational learning materials in an open way so that other students, just the public who is interested perhaps to learn new topics, but also you as researchers, as professors who want to work with material that's already been created by other people, can find this material in open educational resource repositories, and then can also access the material and sometimes even rework the material, reuse it and rebuild it into your own format of choice, to use it as teaching material during your classes and so on. And here is an example of Commons, which is a well-known open educational resource repository. And you see here an example of a material that is related to religious studies about a topic, Latin American liberation theology. This topic, this resource is described with metadata so that you are able to find this resource. You can access the resource immediately, start learning this. Everyone in the world can access this and start learning this. And depending on the license, it also indicates how you can use the resource. This one has a Creative Commons, non-commercial, non-derivative license, which means that you can access it, you can use it as it is, but you cannot reformat it. You cannot take out one slide or one file and put in your own files and so on. You have to use the resource as it was produced by the original authors. It depends. There are other types of licenses which gives you a possibility to rework the material, but sometimes you do not want to do this because people might take information out of context, and then it can create false information, false news, and so on. So sometimes you want to keep it. It has advantages because you as a researcher or as a professor, you can use material that's produced by others, but also you can give visibility and provide material to the wider community yourself as well. Then there's citizen science, which is one of my favorite open science topics. It's actually a practice where you involve citizens, the wider public, in your research. It can be part of the data collection process. I think we all know the typical butterfly counts or bird counts that we do every year. This is actually a data collection process where citizens help to collect data and researchers use the data to make their research, to do their study and their interpretation. But this is a very simple example, bird counting. There are more complex examples where the public takes on more specialized tasks. And I show here a beautiful example from one of my favorite citizen science platforms, Zooniverse, corresponding with Quakers, where the public is asked to help with the transcription of letters from a Quaker community. And in this way, the researchers get access to the data that is hidden in these many corresponding correspondences, so that they can work more easily with it. The public is asked to add keywords to it and read the letters and help the researchers with the data interpretation, because otherwise it would take them a lot of work to get to work with it. It's also interesting to know that there's different types of citizen science tasks possible, and there's this transcription task, adding keyword task, but it can also be other tasks, and you can explore these possibilities on this Universe platform where you have access to different domain information. Very important with citizen science is that, okay, as a researcher, it brings additional visibility to your project, but it also creates more impact of your project, because impact is becoming a more and more requirement for funders. You are involving the citizens in your project, you're involving them in your research, and also making it known and of interest. But one of the conditions for a successful citizen science project is that you make sure you do good community engagement. You really have to be in contact with the volunteers who are transcribing your material or adding keywords to your material. You have to respond to their questions. You have to make sure that the community is kept alive and that they feel that they are doing a worthwhile job. So this is a task that should not be underestimated, but it really has a lot of potential for certain types of data collections. And then research data management, this will probably not be so new anymore, because it's becoming more and more also a funder requirement. For example, that during your research proposal and during the early phases of your research, you write a data management plan that states how you're going to deal with your data collection and your data processing and publication during the entire research lifecycle. The lifecycle you see on the right, you start with your research proposal, where you make your data management plan, take care of ethics, privacy, and other types of legal issues. You start collecting your data, for example, data coming from libraries, from archives, from your research. You also produce new data during your research, and you make notes. You structure, for example, your findings in a spreadsheet, in an Excel, and so on. And then, of course, the next steps are about you write a publication based on the data that you collected and the annotations that you've added and so on. But then, of course, the idea of research data management is that you also share these findings, that you share not only the publication, but also the underlying data that you used for writing the publication. And a way of sharing this data will go up into more a bit details in the next presentations, but you can do this through data publication in research data repositories. And after that, people can cite your data, but they can also you can also find published data from others that you can use in your own research. This all resides in a wider context, and this is something that takes place in the European Open Science Cloud, where all types of research data, but also tools, services, software is being brought together so that all researchers have better access to these materials. For resilience, this connects for us to the Social Science and Humanities cluster, to which we're also connected. And that was it for the introduction on open science. And I go over to Carla, I suppose.
Yeah, thank you, Roxanne, for giving us this overview of what is going on in the digital world. It's fascinating to hear about it. We will get back to you later, but first we will now have the presentation by Lineke Timpers on why we need a research infrastructure for religion.
Okay, so I will be sharing and providing a bit of a backdrop to the necessity of a research infrastructure for religious studies within the field, using the emerging fields of digital religion and digital theology. Yeah, and I'm also a member of the KU Leuven resilience team, as Carla already mentioned. So fundamentally, a research infrastructure catalyzes excellent research by providing those kinds of tools, services, expertise, networks, and data that are needed to conduct research in this specific field. Therefore, it does not produce research, but rather facilitates it, revealing a primarily methodological research focus. How can we make research more efficient across national boundaries? How can we share resources, data, and methodologies in a fair and GDPR compliant way? So to look into that a little bit more, Resilience did some research into the challenges facing the field during its first iteration. And it was observed in the first grant application that religious studies has been marked by a certain fragmentation on a methodological and epistemological level, with scholars facing 4 major issues. So the first is the issue of time. Of course, religious studies covers both historical and present-day contexts, and that results in a plurality of skills, knowledge, and sources, all of which require specialized training and practices. In a similar way, religious studies concerns itself with a plurality of cultural, ethical, social, and political systems, which are deeply interconnected with religious and worldview issues. Just gonna get that. Yeah. And then, of course, religious studies faces the twin problems, essentially, of both an abundance and a scarcity of sources. And Lincoln Mullen writes about this in The Making of America's Public Bible, where he writes that the archival and the printed record is vast. Despite the labors of librarians and archivists, our sources are inadequately cataloged and indexed. And yet, for even the most narrowly targeted scholarly question, the sources available outstrip our time and ability to read them. And digitization of sources makes both the abundance and the scarcity worse. The huge number of databases containing digitized collections of primary sources can feel overwhelming to researchers, while at the same time, digitized sources are nowhere near a full representation of the past, but their accessibility leads researchers to use those sources rather than other sources which are available in the archive but remain undigitized. Each of the above issues bring with them different research methodologies. How do we deal with a multitude of sources within a large time frame span, spanning many different cultural contexts? That results in the final challenge of methodological pluralism, which arises from the interdisciplinarity and plurality inherent to its object of study, the phenomenon of religion as a facet of human existence. And this methodological challenge can be met by the methodological focus of the digital humanities, or more specifically, digital religion. By integrating tools and insights from the former, we can address the challenges of the latter. But first, a bit of a philosophical lens or philosophical conception on what we mean by digitality and the digital turn within the history of, within intellectual history. With turn, philosophically, what we mean is an existential shift within the humanities that transforms human experience. Two historical turns, which impact the digital turn, are one, and this is quite a well-known one, the cognitive turn, heralded by Descartes and his adagium, I think, therefore I am, which from a philosophical perspective marked the shift from the external objective world towards the internal subjective world. This had a huge impact on how we experience the world and how we express those experiences. Another key turn is, and this is a slightly different one, the invention of the printing press, which led to a whole new phase in communication, marked by new arenas of debate, more open and accessible forms of urban public space and sociability, and of course, an explosion of print culture. The printing press had a huge impact on society, on how we receive and how we distribute information. And that impact is only, I think the digital turn still has a larger impact, but the two are quite similar in the way that they occurred and how we perceive them in their time. Such turns are, of course, one of many ways of categorizing the intellectual history of a rather specific geographical region. They are an attempt at understanding ontological shifts in this history, which can only really be identified in hindsight. And the digital turn is one of these kinds of fundamental shifts in how a human being and humankind is viewed. It is quite radical. It's also not that radical that we view it as such a radical shift, but phrases such as an unprecedented evolutionary transition are used, which introduce wholly new categories of thinking. Or Delicata, a moral theologian, writes that it is the very understanding of being human and of agency, human agency, that is profoundly shifting. Delia writes that digital technologies are no longer something external, but they have become part and parcel of who we are. Such a paradigm shift requires a re-examination of what religion, theology, church, and dogma mean for a world inhabited by what we can almost start to call techno-sapiens. So what does that mean for research and the humanities? The digital humanities formed an early response to this shift, combining computer applications with humanities research, education, and dissemination. They were pioneered by the Jesuit Roberto Busa, whose Index Domesticus can be considered the first computing tool built for the humanities. Already in the 80s, he reached out, that was actually much earlier, in the 40s, he reached out to IBM, the International Computing Corporation, to work on a concordance of literally every single word contained in the works of Thomas Aquinas, using the most sophisticated method of his time, paper punching cards. This made it the first computing tool for the humanities, containing a database of 10.6 million lemmas. As the digital humanities grew, defining it proved challenging, mostly because of its methodological origin. It was an innovation in how we do research, not necessarily in where we research or what we are researching. In 2011, the International Digital Humanities Conference proposed the notion of a big tent of the digital humanities, a set of loosely related methodologies and projects that stretch across fields and disciplines, and even across sites of knowledge production. So in this view, the umbrella of digital humanities welcomes and shelters all of the academic and non-academic disciplines relevant to the humanities. With the aim of integrating tools, data, and services into the humanities in service of the humanities. As such, it focuses on what the field can do rather than its technology. And the result is that digital technology is becoming the lens through which research in the humanities is being conducted. So how does that relate to religion and theology? Well, this is one of my favorite quotes from Roberto Busta. Since man is the child of God and technology is child of man, I think that God regards technology the way a grandfather regards his grandchild. In other words, very much a part of research in religion and theology. But first, let's see what the impact of the digital turn in religion. There's already a lot of research on this. This is one of the more well-known theories and examples out there. And this is a book by Heidi Campbell and Stephen Garner called Networked Theology. And in their book, they capture the way in which the internet has drastically changed the experience and expression of religion. They identify these 5 traits of what they call networked religion, each of which show the extent to which internet and online reality has penetrated the more traditional modes of religious expression and experiences. For example, we see with network communities that membership in religion has become based on participation rather than ritual and affiliation, that they are emergent, that they are fluid, and that they are highly personalized. Religious identity has become storied. It has become far more dynamic, with a focus on self-expression and with a freedom to draw from various religious sources. And this is reflected in the notion of convergent practices, where traditional religious rituals are modified, both in how they are conducted and the meanings that we attach to them. They also point out a shift in authority, where religious authority is subject to renegotiation as to the legitimacy of leadership and knowledge, with some of these shifts taking place online and offline together, which leads to the final point, multi-site reality. Religion and the expression of religion is no longer only an offline reality, but there is a constant need to assess and integrate online and offline practices. So to accommodate this shift, new models of studying this digital religion have based themselves on the digital humanities. And we see here an overview of how this field has taken shape, which is a direct reflection of how the digital humanities took shape a few decades earlier. So what we see is, it's also a very methodological description, as you can see. We see a descriptive wave where we first observe case studies and ethnographies which describe online religious phenomena. Then these descriptions become categorized, we draw them together, we analyze the data, we compare these studies, and that leads to the theoretical wave, the hermeneutical step, looking beyond the categories and asking questions of how and why. In other words, moving from the local to the global impact of digitality. So I think in their 2019 paper, Phillips et al., in their paper called Defining Digital Religion, they added a fourth wave, convergent wave, which seeks to ask deeper questions about society and culture that emerge at the end of wave 3. And what we see here is that what they say is that the first 3 waves and the fourth are not chronological not a chronological observation of the field, but they reflect mixed methodologies. These waves interact and build on each other to create the fourth, where the digital is incorporated in each previous step again and again. Which means that this methodological approach is fundamental to how we approach the study of digital religion. So as with the digital humanities, both digital religion and digital theology have an impact beyond a single discipline. They are transdisciplinary, a transdisciplinary methodologically focused response to the digital turn within the humanities. So the question is, how does this relate to a research infrastructure for religious studies? The services that Resilience is working on, which Roxanne already talked about a little bit and we'll talk about more again, are transdisciplinary and they're focused on methodology. So we have services like single platform for generic tools and services tailored to the needs of the field and to the needs of researchers. We have services focusing on community building and networking. We have services facilitating and enabling physical and digital access and providing support for GDPR and fair data and ethical considerations. So all of these help facilitate research in the new reality of digital religion and digital theology. These services are based on researcher needs. We're still collecting data on this. We have been collecting data on this for a while. And here you can see some preliminary results from pilot studies conducted in Bulgaria, Greece, Slovenia, and the Netherlands. 3 key needs arise from this already. The first is access, that researchers need more access to databases, sources, and collections. This is not a given, especially in the south and east of Europe. And focus groups indicated that it was often difficult to find specific sources. And on the other hand, users in the north and west of Europe were often confronted, ironically enough, with the opposite problem. Too many sources in too many different places, taking up too much time to order and prioritize. Second need was that of networking, more community building. There is a strong need for more contact and networking opportunities in specific disciplines and fields of studies. What is often suggested is an online community platform or network to connect researchers within the same specific field or discipline. And of course, all about data. As Roxanne mentioned, this is more and more a reality in conducting research and research projects, more of a requirement, but researchers still find it challenging. How do we store, manage, publish, access data? And this topic will be addressed by my colleagues later on as well. We have also looked into institutional needs, where we see that there is a need to move from the internal perspective to the external perspective. Many research projects are unaware of the data, services, and tools that are available outside of their own university infrastructure. And on the flip side, data and services known within thematic and disciplinary communities and institutions often remain invisible to outsiders. Another issue is that data sets and practices are often created organically and difficult to convert in later stages to fair data. So what we see here is a lot of potential for making research more efficient, for automating research, and for providing more access through a growing open network. And here, all of that, of course, can be answered by a pan-European platform, such as Resilience. So why do we need an RI for religious studies? First, it enables us to meet the methodological challenges facing the field. Then it enables us to meet the needs of researchers and institutions in religious studies. And finally, it helps us meet the societal, political, and economic challenges of our times by ensuring a deeper understanding of the phenomenon of religion in society. And with that, we are in line with what Jan Rusak wrote when he was the ESFRI chair in 2019 to 2022, where he said that the goal of these research infrastructures in Europe is to enable the generation of scientific knowledge underpinning our capacity to respond to major societal challenges. Thank you very much for your time. I think that now I pass it back to Carla.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lineke. I agree with you how important it is that we understand what is behind this digital shift, as you mentioned it, and to understand also the new reality. And it's good to know, I think, how resilience as a research infrastructure is trying to react to this new reality. So thank you very much for this presentation. We will now get back to Roxanne for the second part of your presentation, Roxanne, on FAIR principles.
Thank you, Carla. Okay, again, this is more of a very short introduction to the details that we're going to explore in the workshops in September. But with this presentation, I want to address the FAIR principles and how they've become very important in research and also in religious studies. So perhaps first a bit of a reflection on the FAIR principles and their findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable data. So it's about making research data findable for other researchers, making them accessible so other researchers can explore the data, and interoperable, reusable, meaning that not only they can explore and read the data, access the data, but that they can also work with the data to continue their own research on to build further on this material. And data is something that is present in all research fields. In humanities, researchers often think, okay, I don't have any data, but you do work with a lot of data. Of course, you work with primary and secondary sources, but also with a lot of other types of material, such as bibliographies, critical editions, but also you will do your own research on this material, and during your research project, you will make notes, you will do annotations, you might make structured notes in the form of a spreadsheet or a database so that you can more easily search on the material that you have been reading, have been processing, and so on. And sometimes then you even do automated enrichments. For example, if you have a digitized book, but you want to make it machine readable so you can more easily explore the context of the text, you might have done OCR, optical character recognition, so that the text is searchable throughout the entire book or manuscript. A data set in religious studies is rarely created from scratch, and you work with material that is already available in libraries, in archives, in heritage institutions, and so on. So this is the basis of your research. And then, of course, you will add your own findings to that, or you will do your own enrichments, such as making it machine readable, making annotations, doing transcriptions, and so on. This is all part of creating the new data as part of your research project. And you build on different types of available resources. Often it's a combination of material found in libraries, archives, but also different types of other sources available online, offline, and so on. Here are a few examples. The ones on the left are more the traditional, the primary, secondary sources that you work with, and you go to search in library catalogs for different books that are in relation to your topic. And as an example of the KU Leuven catalog from the Jesuitica collection, and you will find there the metadata on these books, but also digitized material which can be used for the research. Some of this digitized material has already been processed by optical character recognition, so that you not only can read the documents yourself, but that you can even search through the documents, because the PDFs or the images have been transformed to a machine-readable format so that the full text can be searched. This is the enrichment process that has been done by the library, but in some cases, when it's not done by the library, you might do this yourself as part of your research project. You do additional enrichments on the material that you're working with, and these additional enrichments, they become part of your data set, of your entire data set that can be shared with the community. Besides the primary, secondary sources, materials that you work with, you will also make your own notes, annotations, transcriptions, and so on. Often a spreadsheet is used for that, to structure your information and to better be able to analyze it in preparation of your research document. But you can also do it in a more advanced way, for example, in the TEI format, the Text Encoding Initiative format, in which you really add structured metadata to the different encodings that you want to do for the manuscript or book study. If you want to make your research data, so the material that's really at the basis of your research publication, if you want to make it fair, then sharing and publishing it in a research data repository is the way to do that. Here are two examples from a data publication, which I have a bit of a link to religious studies. The example on the right is from Figshare, which is a data repository where you can publish your research data with the necessary metadata. And this is from a census, an overview of New Zealand religious affiliations between 1891 and 2018. So giving a statistical overview of the number of religions presented in the country. And of course, if you want, as a researcher, you can go to these repositories. And if you are interested to work with this kind of material, you can search on the structured metadata. So the data set is made findable by good structured metadata. And then you can access the files as well to read it. But also, depending on the license and the access mechanisms, you can also reuse the data yourself for your furthering your own research. And then the one on the left is from the KU Leuven Research Data Repository. So some institutions have a research data repository that you can use. And also the principle is again the same. You give it descriptive metadata describing how you collected the data set, to what research project it relates, what kind of keywords, and a related publication. You also give a license that gives more information on how you can use the data set. For example, the one on the left has a CC BY license, meaning that you only have to cite the research data set, but you can reuse it in any way. You can add your own information to it, you can build on it, you can do anything you want with it, as long as you make a citation, a reference to the author, to this original data set. So let's go a little bit deeper into FAIR. This, like I said, the first introduction, and we will go in more depth in the workshop in September. So the FAIR, the F stands for metadata and data that should be easy to find for both humans and machines. It means that the repositories where you deposit your data give clear structured metadata, and that you as a researcher do the effort to really describe the data set that is part of your research, so that people can find material more easily. So if they're interested in religious studies, on Armenian texts and so on, if you add this kind of keywords to your metadata, other people will be more easily find this data. But also for computers, for example, that is better being able to better index it, that is more visible on the internet, and it's also able to extract this information to integrate in other platforms. Then we have the A of FAIR, which is accessible. So once you find the data set and you say, okay, this is interesting, I want to work with it, of course you want to access it. So the A in FAIR makes sure that you can access the data set in a proper way so that you can read the contents and that you can even a reference to it accordingly with a DOI, a digital object identifier, a PID, for unique reference back to this data set. The I stands for the interoperability part, which is needed for you to work with the data yourself. And you, for example, it's been put into a certain standard, metadata standard, so that it's interoperable with other data that you collect, but also for other digital applications. Interoperability is important because it then can be integrated more easily into those tools, applications, processes, and so on. And then the reusable part is probably the most important aspect of FAIR because, okay, on the one hand, of course, finding data and accessing data, seeing the data that is used as part of a research publication is very relevant to get a better insight in how the research was established on the basis of what conclusions were made. But for researchers, it's of course interesting to be able to reuse the data, to build on the data that was previously collected in other projects. And by doing so, by making your data fair, other researchers can benefit from it, but also you in time will benefit from it because this practice is really becoming more and more embedded in good research practices and also more and more are required by funders. And with this, we can all find the data that we are looking for in a better way and work on it instead of doing the same thing over and over again, collecting the same data every time a project starts again. So it's really, the why is really getting better access to materials for the future. So you, by publishing your data as FAIR data, you're contributing to this, you're making material for the future research more accessible, but also you will benefit from it because more and more researchers doing this, you will also find more and more material relevant for your research. But also it leads to faster dissemination and recognition of more aspects of your research. Your publication is only one thing out of an entire research cycle. And by publishing data and other types of outputs during your research, you already are giving more visibility to it and getting more credit for the work that you're doing, which is really time consuming, but that you're not getting credit for. You're only getting credit for the publication and not for everything that you have done to get to the publication. And by publishing research data, you can get there. It also can lead to new potential collaborations because people that find your data set and that are interested to work with it, they will more easily reach out to you and to see how you can work together to extend this data and do new research on it. And of course, also it creates additional integrity for your research, and you will inform other researchers on how your findings were established. So what is publishing research data? Well, you usually share research data after a research project ends, and it's usually in combination with your publication because the data is in support of the findings that are in your publication. And you see this more and more often that sometimes there is problems with the integrity of the research, and this has popped up, has been discovered because there were flaws, there were mistakes made in the dataset, sometimes intentionally, and sometimes, of course, we all are human, we all make mistakes. But do not be afraid. Publishing data does not lead to witch hunts to discover false or incorrect data. This is really not the case, but it is a case of really transparency on showing what your findings were based on, but also on advancing research because sources are more available. And then you can also publish your data as standalone research output. It doesn't have to be connected to a research publication. If you think your data is valuable as such and you've put a lot of effort in it and you want to share it with the wider community, you can just publish it without a link to publication as well. So how do you publish it? Well, you can use a research data repository for that. Usually you will make a selection of the data. For example, during your research, you might have collected the digital copies of 100 manuscripts, but in the end, you only selected 20 out of them, and you've made annotations on 20 of them, and so on, and all of the rest was just additional collection material. Well, you will only publish the data that you've worked with in relation to your publication. You can publish the entire data set if you want, but usually you go for a selection related to your research project. You have to take into account restrictions, not your own restrictions, but legal restrictions, such, for example, third-party ownership, copyright, licenses that are on the data. For example, if it says you can only use it in a CC BY a non-derivative format, it means that you can only use it in its original format and that you cannot crop the images or you cannot add annotations on top of that and so on. You have to use it in its original format. So these licenses are important to take into account. We will dive more in depth into that in the workshop in September. Other kinds of privacy issues, for example, if you interviewed people, you will have, of course, collected privacy sensitive material. Then you need to protect your data by doing anonymization and pseudonymization. And of course, it's always according to the principle as open as possible, as close as necessary. Because of legal opt-outs, as the above points are called, you can restrict certain files from public access, and they can, for example, only be accessed after request of other researchers. But it should, preferably, it's best practice to only do these restrictions when there are legal issues in place, and not because you say, I want to keep the data for myself, I don't want to really share it with someone else, because at that point, you better not publish your data at all. If you publish data and you have all of the options to share it publicly, then you should try to do this, and it will also benefit your research. So there are a number of generic repositories that you can use, and I would recommend to use Zenodo for now. In which you can publish data sets, but also other types of research outputs, such as conference proceedings, data management plans, and so on. Resilience is exploring and analyzing the possibility to set up a domain-specific data repository for religious studies. We're still in the exploratory analysis phase. More information will no doubt follow later on in the process. To conclude the key elements of a published dataset, well, first of all, if you publish a dataset in, for example, something like Zenodo, you get a persistent identifier that always points back to this dataset and that you can use in your citations and other people can use to cite your work. So usually this is a DOI, a digital object identifier. You use standardized metadata to describe your data set, to show what is the content of the data set, what keywords are attached to that, and so on. And this really increases the findability, but also the possibility to interpret what the data was about. You give it a license or a terms of use, the way people can use it. For example, you say everyone can use it, but not for commercial purposes. And you give it a CC BY NC, non-commercial license. And then, of course, you add the files, your data files, but also the documentation that is needed for other people to interpret the data set so that they can understand how the data was established and how they can work with it. So more will follow during the online workshops in September on the FAIR principles and religious studies. This was just the top. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Roxanne, for your presentation. I think it was very insightful. We will now go to Federico Alpi. Federico is going to show us what all this means for doing your research in religious studies on a daily basis and how your research can impact from good data management. Federico.
Yes, thank you, Carla. Thank you all. Well, I am not a fair data management expert, but just a researcher in humanities, and specifically Armenian history in my case, Armenian history, religion, and philology. I'm not going, therefore, to discuss good research data management in a technical way today. My goal is instead to show that proper research data management and FAIR standards are in full continuity with our old-fashioned research in humanities. Those who follow this webinar with expertise in research data management will hopefully be able to see how to communicate fairness and proper research data management to humanists like me. Those with expertise in humanities, on the other hand, will learn how to be less wary of the onslaught of acronyms that FAIR brings about. Those who are already confident in both humanities and research data management might find the presentation, therefore, a bit redundant, but it's just 20 minutes long, so you can skip it in that case. Now, let's begin our 20 minutes. First of all, a warning. Data management is not secondary and is actually a vital process. The preservation or loss of data, in fact, is a direct result of data management. To put it in terms for humanists, the greatest events of massive data loss were not the result of natural or human-induced disasters as single events, but rather the consequences of gaps in data management practices, coincident with technological evolutions. When texts, once preserved in scrolls, for instance, were transferred to the more manageable format of codex, that is today's physical book, for an example, many texts were not transcribed and were mostly lost. When texts, once written in capital letters, were transferred to the more manageable format of minuscule letters, many texts were not transcribed again and were, in part, lost. The same, to a lesser extent, occurred with the passage from manuscript to printed book. Advancements in data management, therefore, had a devastating and sometimes catastrophic impact on data. And now we are faced with another major advancement, the digital turn, as we have seen, its new implications and its new vocabulary. Speaking of which, the acronym FAIR, with the meaning, as we have seen, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, is, if you allow me the pun, fairly recent. The concept it expresses, however, has been around for a very long time, and I guess that any scholar, any student, any researcher will find themselves familiar with it once we analyze it into its composing elements. I'll take an example from my own career. I was not born digital, but already during my first years of study at the university, digital assisted research was the rapidly consolidating norm. And when I began my bachelor, online library catalogs were spreading, meta catalogs were being taught to students, and by the time of my master degree, large digitized corpora were already available with high standards, domain-related ontologies, interoperable formats, etc., such as in my case, papyri.info, the Année Philologique Online, the Heidelberg Epigraphic Database. No need to dwell on those here. Since then, as we know, the situation has continued to improve, and digital archives are now an extremely useful tool for our research and for gathering data and for gathering insight on how to manage our data. So these tools are useful, but the point is, useful for what? Well, for research, of course. And the way to conduct a research has changed surprisingly little if we scratch the digital surface. And this is not a bad thing, it's a fair thing. And in fact, as we will see, research, in a sense, has always been fair. Let me show this with the example you have in the slide. Back in my undergraduate days, a professor entered the library room where we were studying, slowly shaking his head in despair. One of his students, he said, wrote that a quote in his bachelor thesis was taken, and I quote, from the old book with the blue cover that lies in the first room of the library, end quote. With such a reference, the book might have been findable with some effort or accessible, provided one had knowledge of that specific library and its topography, of course, but the note would have been hardly interoperable outside of that library and surely not reusable. So it was around 2010, the FAIR acronym would only appear 6 years later, but the concept was clearly there. A completely old-fashioned footnote from the pre-digital age had to follow a certain standard to allow scholars to access and reuse the completely old-fashioned books to which it referred. It's not that much different now. Researchers, even before computers became tools in their work, have applied knowingly or unknowingly FAIR practices very often. The way in which references are designed, as in the example I just made, is meant to make those references and the data they refer to readily and unequivocally reusable to the reader, provided that a common schema, for instance, the author date system, the full note system, etc., is followed. And this is the result of a process that has been ongoing for centuries, especially for written textual material, which has been the backbone of research for millennia. On the other hand, the purpose of researching is not only to discover new things, but also, as we all know, to share them, to make them accessible and interoperable for further improvement, or even just for scrutiny. If we are researchers, we want our research to be known, to be broadly diffused, to be discussed, to be accessible. And therefore, we can say that the very aim of research, as I mentioned earlier, can be described as fairness. In this, religious studies have been pioneering for a long time. First of all, from the perspective of how, to put it in the contemporary jargon, the primary data, or specifically religious data, were made, so to say, reusable. Book-based religions, for instance, have devised very early systems for referring to their sacred books in a way that was findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable, at least for religious scholars, that is. So given my expertise in Armenian studies, I'm showing here a picture of Eusebius tables from an Armenian Gospels, which show the parallel passages in the 4 Gospels, in this case in the Armenian tradition, which is actually a tool that is made to be reusable and to make the text contained in the Gospels readily accessible to the reader. So this is the example I took from my own expertise, but of course I could equally mention examples from other book-based religions, such as Islam or Judaism, from different textual traditions within these religions. Here we have the example of a chain of hadiths, where the beginning of the text shows the chain of witnesses who testify to the authority of each one hadith, for instance. So, well, of course, these are rather crude, very simple examples, regarding very basic types of data and very basic ways to manage it. But religious studies have been important also for producing best practices related to fair data management in general. And remaining on fields close to my expertise, history and philology, the very practice of modern philology was born from needs of religious research and was steered by the necessity of making research data findable, accessible, reusable, interoperable. Let's pick, for example, a critical edition of the New Testament. A dedicated section, the critical apparatus, which you see in the bottom of the page here, of the image, contains what can be described as research data, that is, textual variants from manuscripts, etc., arranged in a specific format, which can be described and has been described, in fact, as a, here I quote, technical language which has been refined in order to express the maximum information with the minimum amount of extra content, data, and to avoid the ambiguity and redundancy inherent in natural languages, end quote. As such, this critical apparatus presents an ordered set of information in which every element, and I quote again, should be approached as the result of an act of scholarly interpretation. And here I end the quote. This is definitely a best practice for maintaining one's own data and making it accessible. If we analyze an example, which we see on the page here, we understand that each element is meant to allow the other users to find, access, interoperate, and reuse the element itself. The siglum, that are the letters, the capital letters you see in the bottom of this example, points to a manuscript. The verbal elements, reduced to a minimum whenever possible, work more as logical operators. And the variant reading that follows the textual elements, the verbal elements, is basically a string of text. And another section of the text in the beginning explains the meaning. I didn't include it here, but believe me, there is one, includes the meaning of each one of the abbreviations and sigla that you see here. So this means that this part, bottom part of the text, the critical apparatus, for instance, allows researchers to access part of the research data used by the editor. Of course, not all of it. We have access to a number of variant readings from various manuscripts, yes, but not to the whole data set used by the researcher. In order to build a critical text, the researcher made use of a large number, more or less large number of manuscripts, and only some of the data contained in the manuscript is included here in the critical apparatus. But this is rightly so, we may say, because the critical text that constitutes my example here is in fact critical. That is, it is the result of a research activity for which the scholar is responsible and accountable in a sense. But that's not all. What makes it into this critical apparatus, for instance, comes, as I mentioned above, from the collation, that is, from the record of all variant reading of each given manuscript used by the editor of the critical text. The editor of the text confronts all the manuscript that he or she wants to use and marks the variant readings in each manuscript. Those that are found significant are included in the critical apparatus, to put it very crudely. This work has been done by hand for long, way before the digital age, and it is now being increasingly automatized through, of course, scholars' supervision. But it's a work that should be carefully formalized, since it could very likely be reused. Think of the the repository of variants that an editor has prepared, it can be reused in the future. The list of variants of a late or bizarre copy of the Quran, for instance, or the characteristic of an unimpressive Coptic gospel might become invaluable in the future when further studies reveal the importance of that specific exemplar of those specific variant readings, and or when the exemplar itself gets lost in the dangerous seas of human history. Such things have occurred in the past and will occur again in the future, I'm afraid. In such eventualities, having correctly managed one's own research data, that is, the collation in the example I just made, is fundamental and has been so even well before the appearance of FAIR principle. As a master British philologist such as Martin West explained, one must bear in mind the possibility that one's collations will one day be used by someone else, and one must therefore make sure that it is clear in this and in all other respects how they are to be interpreted. That is, knowing the rules of data management is fundamental, first of all, for the quality of our work as researchers and as humanists. And this is from a text that, as you can see, is from way before the elaboration of FAIR principles, but is completely compatible with that. By the way, I hope, therefore, to have shown how much principles related to FAIR data management and to good data management practices represent a substantial part of research work even before FAIR existed as an acronym. But how does that translate into our everyday reality of researchers? I have to be honest here. I perceive a lot of extra paperwork when I have to fill out data management plans for accessing funding for research, and I'm quite confident that I am not alone in this as a humanist. Fellow researchers in religious studies have to spend a lot of time understanding what fairness and research data management mean to them and what this principle require from them. Well, this perception is largely based on the fact that there is in part extra work to do, but my point here is that this extra work is not collateral, and sometimes it's not even additional or external to our work. It is something we already do and already know, and is precious for our research and our career development. Only we are used in humanities, in religious studies, to a different vocabulary and sometimes with slightly different categories. And here we come to another point. As researchers in religious studies, we are humanists. We have our practices and our terminology for the very vital process of curing, managing, and preserving our, so to say, research data. Perhaps, therefore, such a delicate issue should not be left entirely in the hands of funding bodies that require us to fill out a so-called data management plan. In fact, such funding bodies often have a perception of humanities that is rather vague, to say the least. This means that researchers, and especially in humanities and even more especially in religious studies, should appropriate, or rather, as I tried to show, reappropriate the discourse on fairness and research data management in dialogue with data curators and actively proposing adjustments to best practices and requirements. This is something that is already happening, as we noticed while building the resilience infrastructure, and at the same time, however, we notice that this does not happen as frequently and as extensively as one might desire. Let me conclude with what we can do in practice as researchers in religious studies to enact good data research management. I will make just these few examples, very basic and very elementary. First of all, we can discover that sharing our research in a fruitful and fair way is becoming easier and easier. There are many repositories available for storing and sharing research products and research data. Zenodo, which you see here, where the amount of stuff related to religious studies is surprising, I have to admit, and even to Armenian studies, is just one example. And this is one point. Second point, take advantage of tools that help you in your research and at the same time help you in good management of your research data. Think of the bibliographic collection, for instance. And here, the most simple example is Zotero, a tool that allows you to build your bibliography, organize it, and include it in your papers in a wide range of customizable citation styles, the old-fashioned footnote. And this is an example of how keeping a clean and ordered data set can be easy, intuitive, and extremely useful. Lastly, since resilience is an infrastructure for religious studies, exploit us. We are in the preparatory phase, so we have few active services now, but support for data research management is something that Resilience want to make available in the future. Stay tuned for further information, and in the meanwhile, use the tools available, such as Ray Research for bibliographic research that I'm showing here. So to sum up, the examples I made were just from a limited typology of data pertinent to religious studies, that is textual data. But there's much, much more. Religion is a comprehensive phenomenon, and so are the studies related to it. And after all, the best practices that I mentioned thus far, from footnotes to the technicalities of the critical apparatus, came from the need of presenting research and research data in a fair way, within the limit of what was once virtually the only means of long-term communication, that is printed paper. Now that we have new means of communication, it is only to be expected that the new best practices are created, adapted, improved. If we do this together, we will reach our goal more quickly, more easily, and last but not the least, more satisfyingly. And hopefully, instead of going where funding leads us, we will go where our researching mind wants to go.
Federico, thank you very much for your presentation and for showing us what it means in practice, working with these principles and giving these concrete examples. I thought it was very ensuring that you said it's becoming easier and easier. So let's go working on it. We have come now to the end of this webinar. And before closure, I would like to thank again Roxanne Wins, Lineke Timpers, and Federico Alpi for giving their presentations on fair data principles and how to work with it. I also want to thank you as the attendant of this webinar for your attention. If you want to know more, then feel free to contact us. You may want to send us an email to our info address. You will find it on the website, and it will also be in the info section on the YouTube channel where you will find this webinar. And finally, I would like to invite you, and I will share my screen, to the webinar, the workshop, I should say, that Roxanne already indicated. You are welcome to subscribe to our workshop September 29 of this year, 2023, in which you can practice working with fair data. You can ask your questions to the experts and get feedback. You will find more information in the link below this video on YouTube, as well as on our website. And if you want to attend, you are invited to register before September 6, 2023. Having said this, the webinar will now be closed. Thank you very much again for your attention.